right, good morning, everyone. If you can hear me in the lobby, start making your way in and take a seat. Just a couple of administrative announcements this morning before we get started. After the morning sessions today, so beginning at the lunch hour, you'll see the signs out front. We will have book signings for one of our speakers this morning, Brady Stiller, and for Robert Gill, who will be one of the breakout speakers tomorrow. So if you don't have a copy of either of their works, you can pick those up. Brady will be signing them at the table. Robert has a very nice setup downstairs in the vendor hall. Please do make sure you visit the vendor hall and pick up whatever books and wares down there that you might like. And for the second session this morning, Christopher Check, there is a handout on the table outside, so just between sessions when you're using the restroom or getting coffee, make sure you pick up one of those handouts. Thank you.
Good morning, everybody. Good morning. We're off to a pretty good start, huh? Now it's just going to keep getting better. And I'm very excited to introduce our first speaker this morning. I first met Brady Stiller when he was a student at Notre Dame. And that means Our Lady, by the way. And he was part of the Chesterton Society at Notre Dame, which is a cool to know that there is one, and just a great group of people, but large number of students that were in the organization. They meet regularly, read Chesterton together. He had a professor named David Fagerberg, who has been a columnist for Gilbert magazine for over 25 years. But you're about to get the latest. The new issue is basically in the mail. You'll be getting it when you get home. And you'll see that it's David Fagerberg's last column. He's stepping down. But we have a replacement for him. It's going to be his former student, Brady Stiller, our next speaker. And Brady was the valedictorian of his graduating class at Notre Dame. And his valedictorian address, he talked about his senior thesis, which was on G.K. Chesterton. So he brought some good things together because Chesterton was a former guest lecturer at Notre Dame in 1930 and got an honorary doctorate from Notre Dame. An honor that he shares with Barack Obama. Okay, all right. Didn't think you could put those two together. I just did. All right. Please welcome Brady Stiller.
You mentioned the valedictorian piece, so I guess I have to sound smart. Well, it's good to be with you all for what is my first Chesterton conference, and I hope many more to come. And it's also the first talk of the day, which means I think I'm responsible for the mood and mood for the rest of the day. So the focus of my talk today, as you can see on the screen, is my recent book publication with Word on Fire, which as Dale just mentioned, did originate from my senior thesis at the University of Notre Dame. But it seems fitting that I would spend kind of the first few minutes on a personal note, and this would be how I came to know our friend Chesterton and how this book came about in nothing less than a providential way. So it wasn't too long ago. Let me see if I can get this to work. There we go. It wasn't too long ago that I was in my second undergraduate year at the University of Notre Dame, and I was majoring in both biology and theology because I believe deeply that faith and science shed much light on each other. It was a time of year that I had the difficult decision of choosing which theology courses I would take the following semester, and I saw a course called Chesterton and Catholicism would be taught by David Fagerberg, who many of you may know. At the time, I knew very little about Chesterton. I'd maybe seen some quotes from him before, but that was about it. And I remember asking my roommate, who had done a lot of reading growing up, about Chesterton, and he said, yeah, Chesterton's writings are a little bit hard to comprehend, and he looks funny. So those comments didn't help my case of whether I should take this course, but I took a leap of faith and I enrolled in the course. And I'm now equally embarrassed and amused to look back on that hesitancy because it was ironic in every way. It was only a few days into the course that I knew I discovered my favorite author, and from then on became known as the biggest Chesterton fan to roam the Notre Dame campus. And that was only the beginning. After finishing the course and being inebriated with Chestertonian spirit, I would next be studying abroad for 4 months in London, which we know is Chesterton's stomping grounds. I had one goal I needed to achieve in that semester, which was to see as many sites associated with Chesterton as I could. So, over the few months in the UK, I saw Chesterton's home in Beaconsfield. I prayed with Gilbert and his wife Frances at their grave. I visited the pubs he would frequent on Fleet Street in London, and I especially made sure to see the special collection of Chesterton manuscripts and other personal items that were housed in Oxford at the time, but soon would be acquired by Notre Dame the following year, and it's moved to London where it is today. The timing was all too perfect for my English field trip and getting to know Chesterton just that semester before. But the opportunity to write a book on Chesterton didn't come until a little bit later, and it came about in just as much of a providential way. Funny enough, I had the opportunity to write an optional senior thesis, which I had turned down because there wasn't anything that I really felt moved to research, only to find myself struck by an idea that I had this idea to write a thesis months beyond the proposal deadline. And I still remember that moment that changed everything. I was in a science lab conducting research, and I had this feeling that I couldn't ignore. It was this subtle but certain conviction that I needed to write a book. And I started jotting down every idea that came to mind, and within a week, I had submitted a thesis proposal, which was accepted months beyond the deadline, and David Fagerberg was assigned as my thesis director. How fitting. All of a sudden, I had the requirement to write a thesis, which should be 60 pages max. That sounds like a lot of writing, right? That's what I thought at the time. But not even a year later, I ended up writing over 200 pages, knowing I produced a manuscript that needed to be published as a book. Then, 4 years later, and Word on Fire is now marketing the book. I think God knew what he was doing. So that brings me to where I am today, where I get to share with you that same exciting vision that I saw many years ago and got to write about. So let's get into it. There are 3 main areas I want to talk about today, and they follow the flow of my book. We can think of each section as answering a key question. The question of the first section is, what is Chesterton's worldview? The answer, as we'll quickly see, is that he views life as a story, particularly a romance story. And this isn't just a personal worldview, but a definitive philosophical position on what is determined and undetermined in life. The second question follows from this. What are the stories that we are living? We'll see how each of our lives is a story, but also that each of our lives is meant to find its place in a grand story, the grand story of creation spanning space and time. And finally, the third question is, how does Chesterton's philosophy hold up against other philosophical positions on freedom and meaning? We'll see that the main worldviews Chesterton argued against were determinism, existentialism, skepticism, and nihilism, and each has a different stance on meaning and our role in defining it. In the end, we'll see that Chesterton's philosophy, which is ultimately the Christian philosophy, is most true to reality, upholding that the meaning of life is a paradox, that the meaning of life is not a little bit objective, a little bit subjective, but perhaps more accurately, fully objective and fully subjective at the same time, even if we can't fully wrap our minds around that. So now we start with the first area, which is what is Chesterton's worldview? I would say Chesterton's worldview is arguably on display in every one of his books, as we know, but I think it's especially apparent and palpable in Orthodoxy and the Everlasting Man. Famously, as the opening and justification of his great work, Orthodoxy, which is personally my favorite book of his, Chesterton eagerly took the provocation of Mr. George Street to give us an account of his own worldview and why he believes it is more sound than the worldviews of those he criticized. Chesterton's worldview, as laid out in Orthodoxy, can be summarized as this. He had always viewed life as a story, a worldview that he would later discover had been the Christian worldview for 2 millennia. Even Chesterton's early life, it seems to me, could be characterized as a search for a right worldview that best explains this reality. It never was a question of whether worldviews were a matter of personal taste for Chesterton. Instead, he'd always treated worldviews in relation to an objectively right worldview. Even if he would never come to find it, he was convinced that other people had already found it. And it was in this very way of viewing life as a story that he would find himself unknowingly already within the bounds of Christianity. So Chesterton believed that the view of life of a story is one that best explains this existence, and therefore one that all people should have if they are to discover the key that unlocks the secrets of the world. Far beyond a metaphor or personal liking, to view life as a story is, I think, an audacious and expansive philosophical framework that seeks to explain all things, all peoples, all times, all places. Ultimately, to view life as a story is the position of the Christian tradition, and like any serious philosophical worldview, it seeks to explain everything and to traverse the universe, leaving no stone unturned. So the idea of story, it meant many things to Chesterton, and we'll take a look at 3 of those aspects. First, for Chesterton, a story has a storyteller who intentionally determines every detail down to the smallest of details. Second, a story has an ideal ending that it should achieve, but is not predetermined to achieve. And third, a story is a work of art with proportion. The first aspect is a fairly obvious point, but it has all the significance for Chesterton, that if life is a story, there's a storyteller. This was Chesterton's earliest worldview, far predating his exploration of Catholic Christianity, and this is a significant claim that opens up a whole line of questioning. Who is the storyteller? Why did the storyteller choose these exact details? What is the ideal ending that the storyteller has in mind? I think through Chesterton's wisdom, we learn that God is the grand storyteller, but God is not the only storyteller. We are also the storytellers. If God is truly free, and if our freedom is not an illusion, but actually a powerful capacity to create change in reality, and if the divine and human freedoms are not mutually exclusive, then we arrive at the concept of co-creation, whereby both God and man are cooperatively writing the story. Through this ordering capacity of the will, both God and man order creation in such a way that it becomes meaningful. And I think that's how Chesterton defines freedom, and I think that's exactly right. The second principle is that the story may end in any way, but it should not end in any way. We can see here that Chesterton was arguing against a pure objectivism that would claim that our life story is predestined to end a certain way, or that we're not truly free. While he asserts that a story may end in any way, this does not mean he believes it ought to end in any way, as if one ending were just as good as another. An author sets a standard for how the story ought to end, but the characters have the freedom to make the decisions that will bring them closer to or further from achieving this purpose. So when Chesterton was asked if mankind grew better or worse, or remained the same, he answered, "It might depend on how mankind chose to go on." I think that's quite right. A third and last principle that I'll highlight is that Chesterton viewed story as a work of art with proportion. An artwork conveys the deliberate choices of the artist. I love that quote of Chesterton's that highlights how there's something in reality that evokes such a strong, visceral sense of choice and action, that this world is not absent of design and purpose. He says, every color has in it a bold quality as of choice. The red of garden roses is not only decisive but dramatic. Like suddenly spilt blood, he feels that something has been done. Likewise, beautiful artwork has order and proportion. Art tends to be more beautiful the more that it aligns to objective reality. This example of Chesterton's as well, to draw a giraffe, the artist must draw an animal with a long neck and not a short one. So it goes with our life stories. Are the stories of our lives not more beautiful when they have order, congruency, and alignment to objective values? Even then, and paradoxically, our individuality is more fully expressed. Chesterton captures that idea of proportion when he speaks of the bigger picture that we all fit into. He says, it must be a definite picture composed of these elements in their best proportion and relation. Only a personal God can be leading you to a city in which each of you contribute exactly the right amount of your own color to the many-colored coat of Joseph. According to this passage, people are their own color. Here's the subjective element of the picture. Every person's color is meant to contribute exactly the right amount, he says. That's the objective proportion of the picture. And so as time goes on, the unfinished picture gains more colors and more details, but it ought to look a certain way when it is finished at the end of time. So those are the core principles of story, according to Chesterton. You can kind of see how they have particular stances on objectivity and subjectivity of life. And the same goes for how Chesterton views romance, which we'll take a look at now. So there's no doubt that Chesterton was a romantic. We know how Chesterton is a medievalist, and he had an appreciation for many of the literary figures of the Romantic movement. So Whitman, Shelley, MacDonald, for example. And so naturally, for Chesterton, the ideal genre of the story of life, you guessed it, is romance. Romance meant particular things to Chesterton, I would say least of which was a mushy sentimentalism. Romance meant three things that I'll highlight: adventure, fighting for the one who is loved, and thrift. And so to look at that first element of adventure, the story of life is dangerous and exciting, practically as much as spiritually. Salvation is not guaranteed. It depends in part on our faith and how we act. For the Christian, that's not a terrifying reality, but instead an exciting responsibility to guard this one life, the only one that we have, from assaulting dangers that threaten the attainment of the good. Because of the elements of danger on our spiritual journeys, the adventure of life becomes an opportunity to avoid dangers and to conquer evil in pursuit of good. Chesterton makes another observation about adventures. He says, adventure is a thing that chooses us, not a thing that we choose. I feel like that's certainly the case with my own life. Maybe it's not an accident, but an expression of this paradoxical truth that God has tended to call the weak, the poor, or the least adventurous to a divinely appointed mission that would never leave them or the world the same. Second, the notion of fighting for someone or something that is loved is a key expression of Chesterton's romanticism, one that profuses his defense of patriotism, and perhaps is best expressed by the story of St. George and the Dragon. He says, in every romance, and actually learned this quote from Dale, in every romance, there must be the twin elements of loving and fighting. In every romance, there must be three characters. There must be the princess, who is a thing to be loved. There must be the dragon, who is a thing to be fought. And there must be St. George, who is a thing that both loves and fights. So maybe one application to our life story is to view the devil as a personal adversary to our story, and we're fighting to guard our soul from the powers of hell. Another is Chesterton's idea of patriotism, which, as we know, is that a thing must be loved before it is lovable. And even if our life story seems at the moment to be off track or in shambles, we must love the life that God gave us and fight to bring it into better shape. So then, that final element of romance that I'll highlight is thrift, or the limits inherent to life. I saw someone commenting in the app on my talk that the Chesterton's favorite part of the picture was the frame, so someone was getting ahead of me. So Chesterton has a lot to say about thrift, whether it's in Orthodoxy, The Defendant, or his other works. He says, "Thrift is the really romantic thing. Thrift is poetic because it is creative. So thrift is creative in the sense of ordering the limited materials of this life to create something more meaningful than the sum of its parts. Each person has only one life to live. Every moment of every day is unrepeatable, and no two decisions are ever the same. So it's precisely within those limits that we use our freedom to order the materials of this life to become more meaningful. That's to say, more aligned to reality, more like life, and in stronger relation to objective values." So as we'll see shortly, thrift is also something that the divine author embraced in becoming human. The unlimited God limited himself. He bound himself in a manger. He pinned himself to the cross. He let his life be taken from him. God was not afraid of limits, and it makes me think, why should we? Perhaps it's through limits that we find our salvation in the highest joys in life. So that's the first of three areas that I wanted to talk through today, and really that's just highlighting that Chesterton views life as a romance story, and that's a philosophical position, I would argue, about the objectivity and subjectivity of meaning. So the second area I will get into is about the stories we are living. On the one hand, as I mentioned earlier, each of our lives is a story. On the other hand, each of our lives is a story, being part of a much grander story that spans space and time, the grand story of salvation history. And so through our reading of Chesterton, we can observe how our individual stories and the grand story share a similar arc. The arc of the grand story of salvation history, as Chesterton saw it, and I think largely conveys in The Everlasting Man, is that the story starts off in the bliss of Eden, where man and woman were created with a glory above every other creature. We knew our dignity, and we lived according to God's purposes. But, tragically, the cosmic conflict ensued, where the devil tricked humanity to defy God's purposes, and the story of humanity has been marked by those negative consequences ever since. We have lost our way. We have more dignity than the other creatures, yet we are farther from our ultimate purpose. We are ridden with strife and anxieties. As Chesterton points out, the original sin marked the start of what he calls a search, an existential search for truth and meaning. Interestingly, Chesterton focuses much on the pagan culture in The Everlasting Man, so the pagan culture whose poetry and mythology and philosophy bear a sense of this search, but they also bear a deep sense of sadness that all of these things end in death. The pagans felt deeply that there was a truth to be discovered, yet it was elusive and unattainable, and life, despite all its goodness, is ultimately a tragedy. So the next move in the grand story was a divine sleight of hand that caught us by surprise, in achievement of the impossible. The one true God, truth himself, the author of humanity's story, somehow had to sneak into his own world, and we didn't recognize him. The unlimited God limited himself as one of us. The author of life ran adamantly toward death, and God himself on the cross seemed even at a moment to be an atheist, embracing divine abandonment, as Chesterton brilliantly notes. It's all very strange. In fact, Chesterton calls it the strangest story in the world. It doesn't really make much sense until the moment that it makes all too much sense, and it's too perfect to be true. The story of humanity had not been scrapped for a new one, but instead resurrected and still bearing the wounds of crucifixion. It's interesting that the wounds themselves are part of the story, but as Chesterton notes, that's because God is so powerful that he can make good with the evil inflicted on humanity, and he knows the way out of the grave. Nothing would be wasted. So, just as with the trajectory of the grand story, so it goes with the trajectory of our individual stories. Our lives start in the state of innocence and goodness, much resembling the bliss of Eden. As Chesterton felt, it's in those early years of life that those are a more perfect and a more real life. But as every person experiences, this period of goodness comes to a quick end with the Age of Reason, which marks the start of a lifelong battle against evil. To many people, including Chesterton, this ending of innocence comes as a violent affront. We are faced with a decision of who we will serve from that point on, and what's clear is that we cannot go back. The only way back to a pure goodness is to move forward into battle, to take on responsibility, to take on evil, to take on death with Christ that we might rise with him. And it's in doing so that we find our purpose, which can certainly come to be known in this life and give directionality to our lives, but at the same time, and paradoxically, that purpose unfolds throughout our lives, bearing the element of surprise. And just as we saw with the grand story, God is not wasteful with our own individual stories, even if we spend much of our lives denying him, damaging ourselves, or bringing our stories far off course. It's true that some decisions are more impactful on our life stories than others. I think that's how the Catholic Church views venial sin versus mortal sin. But I would say no story is so ruined that it cannot be redeemed. No atheist is so far from God that they cannot be found, because God outdid even the most desolate atheist in experiencing the divine abandonment on the cross, as we saw. And when resurrecting our stories, God doesn't so much erase the past as much as he glorifies the wounds, which somehow God has a purpose for. And like the risen Christ, we bear the wounds of our past, but these are not a reason for shame, but instead a testament to God's power and the means through which he wants his salvation to come into the world. So that's the second area of the three that I wanted to talk about today, how each of our life stories fits into the grand story of creation and how they follow a similar arc. So now for the third and last area. If the key question up to this point has been, what is Chesterton's worldview and what are its philosophical principles on freedom and meaning, then the question hereafter is, how does Chesterton's worldview stand up against these other philosophical positions? And we want to know which one's right, which is most true to reality. Chesterton's writings consistently argue against four philosophical worldviews on freedom and meaning, ones that have been persistently present throughout history, even to this day. And those are determinism, existentialism, skepticism, and nihilism. These four worldviews are interrelated in a particular way that is relevant to this discussion. Each of these worldviews, like Chesterton's worldview, takes a definitive stance on the meaning of life and our role in defining it. Where exactly they stand relative to each other, I think, is best understood by placing them on a spectrum that I call the spectrum of meaning. The spectrum spans from the extreme of pure subjectivity to the extreme of pure objectivity. And so first, at the extreme of pure objectivity, stands the philosophical position of determinism. Determinism was a philosophical system that Chesterton battled throughout his life, as we know. With the flourishing of evolutionary theory in the late 19th century, many intellectuals and philosophers were adamant about reducing human life and actions to explanation by scientific laws and evolution. From his early debates with Mr. Blatchford to his book, The Everlasting Man, I would say Chesterton's apologetical career is marked by a staunch defense of free will and the undeterminedness of life, both against a scientific determinism, but also a religious determinism. Of greatest interest to Chesterton were Calvinism, a form of spiritual determinism, and evolutionary determinism, a form of scientific determinism. For Calvinism, one's eternal spiritual fate is predetermined and unalterable by any act of the will. For evolutionary determinism, every so-called free action, thought, or feeling is ultimately the result of one's genetics and environment. Even love would be explained away as a product of natural selection, of hormones locking into receptors and neurons firing in select patterns. And these very arguments are why I chose to study biology and theology at the same time at Notre Dame. Second, at the other end of the spectrum, existentialism occupies the position of pure subjectivity. Existentialism was another target of Chesterton's arguments, which he saw in his time in the form of what he calls neo-paganism, free love, individualism, and subjective morality. What united these subjectivist movements was a tendency to overemphasize free will, overemphasize subjectivity, and personal creation of meaning. I argue that existentialism is probably the dominant undertone of our culture today. Its echoes are all too familiar when we hear statements like, "No one can determine what is meaningful for my life," or that societal standards are all a result of social convention, or that morality and truth are relative. So third, in terms of skepticism, this is the claim that we cannot make a definitive claim about the existence of freedom and meaning, which would occupy the middle of the spectrum. It's another worldview that Chesterton condemned for its debilitating effects on faith, but probably more especially on reason. He recognized that skepticism leads to the paralysis of the will, which ultimately would thwart the intentional pursuit of a meaningful life if we're stuck wondering, can I even have a meaningful life? Perhaps it's not surprising that Chesterton's entire career is likewise marked by a battle against skepticism, as he was an apologist for Christianity among a modern intellectual class where skeptical tendencies were prevalent. And fourth, nihilism is the position that existence has no meaning. It does not have a place on the spectrum insofar as it denies the existence of meaning. For Chesterton, nihilism is the most dangerous worldview and the most offensive to a world that struck him as anything but meaningless. In his understanding, nihilism was essentially the destination of any imperfect worldview that did not correct its course. And so fifth and finally, the question remains, where does Chesterton's worldview stand on the spectrum of meaning, and which of these worldviews is most true to reality? One possibility is that Chesterton's worldview falls somewhere in the middle of the spectrum. That would seem to make some sense, that it upholds some of the objective and some of the subjective elements of life. However, and this was kind of the key insight behind writing this book, I think there exists another possibility, one that is maybe even more characteristic of Chesterton's worldview, and that might be considered the philosophical worldview on freedom and meaning that is most true to reality. That position on the spectrum is one of paradox, especially as Chesterton understands it as both extremes operating at their full strength at the same time. So rather than a diluted mix of objectivity and subjectivity, which like white and red mixed to get together to become pink, an example of Chesterton's, perhaps Chesterton's worldview, that life is a story, holds that life is both very objective and very subjective at the same time, where subjectivity operates at its full strength within objectivity at its full strength, saying yes to both. This paradoxical position could also rightfully be understood to be the Christian philosophical position, I think, because paradox, as Chesterton notes, is inherent to the dogmas of Christianity. Just as Jesus was not 50% God and 50% man like a demigod, but 100% God, 100% man, in a way that we might not be able to fully understand, could this not also be the Christian logic for answering that ancient ontological question of the determinedness and undeterminedness of meaning? And would it not also be an intuitive conclusion that the meaning of life is both 100% determined and 100% undetermined, that we are very free to determine meaning within God's created order, but that God has determined the bounds of what could be meaningful, that God has set an objective standard for truth and goodness and already determined the best goal for us to journey toward? It's this capacious position that Chesterton's wisdom would have us see is the genius solution of the Christian philosophy, one that satisfies what Chesterton calls this double spiritual need, the need for the mixture of the familiar and the unfamiliar, the determined and the undetermined, the objective and the subjective. I noticed that quote early on in Orthodoxy, and I felt like that was at the crux of this. I want to close focusing on nihilism and Chesterton's response given the significance. It's true that any worldview that does not ultimately align to reality is bound to crack, even if it can work for a while, or explain many things, or persist from generation to generation. But there inevitably comes that breaking point when the determinist or the existentialist or the skeptic is tired of pretending that his worldview explains this existence in an existentially satisfying way. When this crisis moment comes, the person finds himself at an existential decision point. He feels his whole being rebelling against that worldview that he knows cannot work anymore. Two inevitable options arise at this point. Either he corrects his worldview to be more true to reality, or he doubles down on his rebellion and blames this existence for the desperate meaninglessness of it all. The former is the road to the Christian worldview, which welcomes every newcomer with wide open expanses to run, fresh air to breathe, and a new way of seeing the world, and not just one way of seeing the world, but perhaps the way that the world was always meant to be seen. The latter is the horrific road toward the barren wasteland of nihilism, where the world will make much less sense than it formerly did. And so it would not be inaccurate to call Chesterton's life a battle ultimately against nihilism, which is the final result of all errant philosophies that he challenged throughout his life. Nihilism is really the ultimate curse of this wonderful existence for Chesterton. And he summarizes the cold despair of nihilism in this passage. He says, "Its despair is this, that it does not really believe that there is any meaning in the universe. Therefore, it cannot hope to find any romance. Its romances will have no plots. A man cannot expect any adventures in the land of anarchy, but a man can expect any number of adventures if he goes traveling in the land of authority. One can find no meanings in a jungle of skepticism, but the man will find more and more meanings who walks through a forest of doctrine and design. Here, everything has a story tied to its tail, like the tools or pictures in my father's house." That rich passage is how Chesterton ends his autobiography, and it is how I will end my talk. Chesterton's life was not disintegrated by simplistic philosophical explanations or paralyzed by doubts. Rather, his life was a romance story with a thrilling plot, with his childhood and his adulthood bearing upon each other. Chesterton intuited that Christianity was not playing the zero-sum game of other philosophies. The objectivity of the Father's design allowed Chesterton to live more freely into the gifted adventures of a story that could have ended in any way. Objectivity and subjectivity, like the lion and the lamb, lie down together in the wake of Christianity. And so, if we're to test the authenticity of Chesterton's worldview, we might ask ourselves, how did Chesterton's life end? I will speak for myself. That was a man fully alive. That was a great soul. That was a worldview this weary world needs. Thank you.
So, stay close. We're gonna let a couple people grill you. We have time for just a couple of questions here, but first I want to say that he does have some copies of the book, and we will get them available out there, one way or the other. So do get his book. But are there any questions right now for Brady? We can time for a couple of questions. Right here.
In seminary, I learned about Hans Urs von Balthasar and the Theodrama, and that was very attractive to me. Do you have any, is there any matches or,
Absolutely. Now for the unscripted part. Absolutely. I wanted to name the book, to the extent that it would have worked, the Theodrama of Chesterton. Absolutely ties to this. I'm sure as some people in this room do as well, I follow Word on Fire. I think Bishop Barron played an influence on this as well, planted those original seeds. And also, there was a lot of the Catholic tradition that I had studied in my theology studies, and I found this element of story not just in Chesterton, but really in all of the great theologians over time. I think Chesterton, it just seemed very fitting that I would choose to go with him. As you could probably tell from my talk, he just has a way of capturing that. Balthazar, absolutely. I think his idea of the theodrama, and of course, Bishop Barron has that as a really core part of his ministry. I think that's why he latches on to Chesterton as well. So if I am to write another book, which I don't have plans on right now, perhaps Balthazar would be the direction, because I absolutely agree with you that that's very, very similar and right up his alley.
Hi, how you doing?
Good.
My question is, as a young graduate, how do you feel is the best way to reach out to people your age or younger who are in school, who are struggling with these ideas and concepts of skepticism and objectivism? I know my daughter's a student at University of Pittsburgh, and so I hear all the stories of extremes in both directions.
Absolutely. It would be great if there was a network of Chesterton high schools. If only something like that could exist. That would be a great avenue, is a first idea coming to mind. Second of all, I feel like a book is a great opportunity. No, I won't vouch for my own book. That's the challenge of our times. And again, going back to the story of why I wrote this book, that's something I felt deeply. I saw it in my peers. I grew up with a lot of friends. I went to Catholic schools my whole life. Most of them are not practicing Catholicism anymore. I think there is the undertone of existentialism and skepticism, and I guess speaking for myself, and this is maybe my own personal strategy, but when I have conversations with my own peers, I tend to like to not come in with an answer for them. I like to ask questions. And I've done that many times throughout my life. And I even proposed this argument, not painting it religiously, but almost philosophically. And it was very well received and resonated deeply with a lot of my good friends from growing up who were just not really religious anymore. And this philosophical argument, I felt like, was almost what a lot of what they were looking for. I think it gave an answer. It certainly answered it for me and why I wanted to put this book out there. And when I explained it to my two friends, they said, "That's genius. I never really thought of it that way." And I can see, and in my opinion, I think whether you lean toward existentialism and subjectivism, whether you see the world as a little bit more determined, karma, etc., all of those worldviews have a place within this more capacious, holistic framework. I think ultimately has a better answer versus a worldview that takes one truth and runs with it. Free will is a good thing, but we can't overemphasize it. We also need guiding values, but we can't put too much structure around it, or we'll break down. So I've done a lot of this thinking as well. I think the practicality is maybe an answer for the whole church to be thinking about in really every ministry. I'm sure many of you are involved in ministries, but at least for me, this was a little bit more of an intellectual journey, even though I've always been very convicted Catholic growing up and discerned the Jesuit priesthood for 6 years. But this was definitely a critical part, and I hope this argument is doing just that for young people.
One last question.
In your framework specifically, you have the skeptic, anchored right in the middle, and you encounter people like that, especially in universities, in the intellectual life, where they believe that the enlightened way of thinking is just to say you can't decide one way or another. But what does Chesterton say, or what do you say? In the end, that tends to typically be a false premise. We make decisions one way or another on things. We act in a definitive way one way or another, whether we want to intellectually acknowledge it or not. So how long can the skeptic go on before he knowingly or unknowingly gets pushed into subjectivity or perhaps into nihilism?
It can't go on forever, as you know. And that goes back, maybe you asked about what I think. That's why I like to ask people questions, because instead of trying to tell them what I believe, you find that people circle back on themselves. You're kind of forcing them to be in a position of defending their position, and they realize it's illogical, it's not sound, it doesn't hold up. And I feel like those have been the most effective conversations that I've had. I never gave an answer. I never even really shared what I thought. It's just I asked questions and made them think about it, and they'll probably walk away thinking, I need to change the way that I think about these things. And I think for Chesterton as well, if I can remember the quote properly, of course he says a lot about freedom, but we have to make decisions, and that limits choices inherently. That was certainly something I explored in the book, is what is the true version of freedom? Because there's a lot of versions of freedom that are out there. If I have all the choices in the world and keep my choices open, options open, I'm the most free, but then you never become anything. That's one version of freedom. And so what I proposed, as I think I highlighted in the talk, is the Christian view of freedom, if you understand it properly, is the opportunity to order the materials of this world in a meaningful way toward objective reality. And that truly is a powerful capacity. One last thing I'll say to maybe distinguish what I call it is God's freedom, which he can create from nothing, and then what he's already created, he's able to order in a meaningful way. We're created in God's image and likeness, but we cannot create from nothing, but we can order what has already been created. That's still a very powerful capacity. So just making that distinction, that we're not so powerful that we can say something that is untrue is true, something that is immoral, oh, that's good, that's fine for me. That would be leaning toward creating from nothing. And so if we kind of properly understand freedom, that's kind of a key insight that I noticed in writing this.
All right, please join me in thanking Brady. He's fantastic. What an outstanding talk. This is great. Wow. Okay, we're going to take advantage and take a little break here and come back at about 10 for Christopher Check, and we'll keep those intellectual wheels